I'm Yaakov Katz, and welcome to another episode of the Jewish People's Podcast. Before Chabad became the global movement we know today, with emissaries in every corner of the world, it faced extinction, literally. In the dark years of Soviet repression, when Judaism was being crushed and its leaders were imprisoned or executed, one man helped keep the flame alive, Rabbi Yosef Yitzchak Schneersohn, the Sixth Lubavitcher Rebbe. My guest today, Rabbi David Eliezrie from California, tells this extraordinary story in his new book, Undaunted, how the Sixth Lubavitcher Rebbe, Yosef Yitzchak Schneersohn, saved Russian Jewry, reimagined American Judaism, ignited a global Jewish renaissance. It's the story of courage under tyranny, a faith that refused to die, and a visionary leader who transformed despair into rebirth. Everybody knows the last Rebbe, the Lubavitcher Rebbe, but the Sixth Rebbe was the one who built underground networks of Jewish life in the Soviet Union, escaped Nazi-occupied Europe, came to America, and redefined what Jewish revival would mean. In the conversation with Rabbi Eliezrie, we explore what the Sixth Rebbe's legacy teaches us today, what his leadership was like, resilience, and the power of how one person's vision can change the course of Jewish history. Have a listen. Rabbi David Eliezrie, it's great to have you on the JPPI podcast. Thank you so much for joining me.
My pleasure to be with you, Yaakov.
So we're here because we've known each other for quite a while, I have to say, and it's always been a pleasure to have conversations over the years about a range of issues from Israel-diaspora relations to religious life here in Israel, and of course in the diaspora and out in the West Coast where you live and are based. But we're here to talk about your new book called Undaunted, which is the full title, Undaunted, How the Sixth Lubavitcher Rebbe, Rabbi Yosef Yitzchak Schneersohn, saved Russian Jewry, reimagined American Judaism, and ignited a global Jewish renaissance. But for the purpose of this podcast, and for people who don't know one Rebbe, two Rebbes, three Rebbes, let alone...
In Chabad, there were seven Rebbes altogether.
Rebbes. Everybody knows Rabbi Menachem Mendel Schneersohn, the Lubavitcher Rebbe. Everybody has seen his picture plastered across the world, whether you're walking down the Upper West Side or driving on the Ayalon freeway into Tel Aviv, or you're in Melbourne or Johannesburg or anywhere in the world, you will see him and you will see his followers who are out there asking. I was the other day, where was I? I was in Miami, and I saw them coming at me, and I knew what they were going to ask. Are you Jewish? And I said, yes. Did you put on his phone today? And I said, yes. But the Lubavitcher Rebbe, everybody knows. The Sixth Rebbe was his father-in-law. But tell us, who was this person? Why is the Sixth Rebbe important?
He's I think he's one of the most consequential leaders of 20th century Jewry. Born in 1880, died in 1950. He was the son of the fifth Rebbe, Rosh Shalom Dov Ber. He becomes Rebbe at a very crucial moment in Jewish history with the advent of communism in Russia. He creates a secret clandestine system in Russia. When all the great rabbinical leaders leave Russia and they say, okay, when they're faced with communism and they leave and they take their great centers of yeshivas, scholarship, and they move them to Poland and to Lithuania, etc., he stays. And he says, I'm not leaving, I'm standing up for Russian Jewry. He creates a clandestine system that keeps Judaism alive in Russia until the fall of the Soviet Union, until the disintegration of the Soviet Union, which is something that his father had foretold in an amazing encounter. 1927, he's arrested, sentenced to death. Eventually, he's exiled. He comes to Western Europe, where he has to reinvent Chabad, Hasidic life for Western Europe. In the interim, he spends almost a year in America visiting. To give you a sense, he comes to America in 1929. He gets off the train in Chicago, and according to the Chicago Sun-Times, not a Chabad newspaper, he says there were 15,000 people waiting for him at the train station.
Wow.
In Detroit, a week or two later, there's 10,000 people at the train station. He gets massive welcomes, visits with the President of the United States, but most importantly is trying to raise money to save Russian Jewry and to reinvigorate Judaism in America and to connect to the disparate, small, embryonic Hasidic community. Then he goes back to Warsaw, goes back to Latvia and to Poland, where he creates a yeshiva system which lasts to Nazism. And astonishingly, when the Nazis invade, well, the American government goes to the German government and says, you know what, there's this real important rabbi, would you save him? And the Germans think to themselves, you know what, we want to be good with America. They're still neutral, so they save the Rebbe. He gets off the boat in 1940, March of 1940 in the United States. Orthodoxy is basically holding on for dear life in this country, in the United States at this point. It's very much a siege, Judaism. We got a few leftover religious people. And he says, no, America is nicht anders, America is not different, and we're going to transform Judaism in the country. Creates the first network of Jewish day schools. He changed the mentality of American Jews to see themselves as their identity. And in the post-war era, you see Chabad all around the world today. Well, how did it begin? Which is a story which is in the book. There were 1,000 Hasidim who escaped Russia on false passports in 1946 and 47. A lot of them come to Israel. A lot of them he sends, okay, you guys go to Australia, you guys go to France, you go here, you go there. And he's laying the foundation. So when you come today to France, and Chabad is the largest Jewish organization in France, you come to Australia or South Africa, where 80% of the rabbis in synagogues are Chabad rabbis. It all started by the seeding that he did, in the late 1940s. So in many ways, here's a man who saved Russian Jewry. And it's a big statement on the cover of the book. He changed the attitude of American Jews toward their own identity, and toward the end of his life, his last act is to create a school system in Morocco. He's worried about the Jews in Morocco.
So, so here's the question, because I'd like to think I know a bit about Chabad. I know a bit about Lubavitch. I don't know much about the Sixth Rebbe. We know about the Alter Rebbe. The first Lubavitcher Rebbe. I mean, there's a bunch in the middle who are well known, less known. Why is the Sixth Rebbe less known? Let's say I
think the Sixth Rebbe, or he's called in the lexicon of Chassidim the Frierdiker Rebbe, which means the previous Rebbe. So the Frierdiker Rebbe, Rabbi Yosef Yitzchak Schneersohn, I think was overshadowed by his son-in-law, and the Rebbe becomes such a towering personality, in the latter part of the 20th century, where prime ministers and presidents of countries come to see him. You saw this crazy situation about a month or two ago. President Milei comes from Argentina, and he brings a portrait. What's the gift to the prime minister of Israel? A portrait of him meeting with the Rebbe. I mean, think about this. The president of Argentina is telling it's just like, and what does Bibi give to Trump as a gift in the White House? $1 from the Rebbe. This is surreal. I must tell you, as a chassid, I can't believe this kind of impact. So the Rebbe has become a tremendous influence in world Jewry, and even though it's over 30 years since his passing, we still feel the power of his ideas and personality, and we see the impact of his work around the world. But if you look at something historically, it really began this transformation with the previous Rebbe on many, many different levels. And there's a saying in Chabad that the previous Rebbe had one chassid, his son-in-law. So, and he mentors the Rebbe to assume that position. As a young man in the 30s, they spend an immense amount of time together. And you see this in the writings of the Rebbe. He writes diaries from the 1930s about his interactions with his father-in-law. So, maybe outside the Chabad world, his figure is not so dominant, not so important, but within the Chabad community, if you say the word Frierdiker Rebbe, previous Rebbe, etc., or they're called the Rebbe Rayatz according to his name, everybody knows who he is. It's well known, but I don't think that every Jew in the world, as much as Chabad may have become popular, and there's, I had a very interesting experience today. I went on a trip with the Jewish Agency to northern Israel. So one guy comes over to me. I got on the bus. The first thing comes over to me, the chairman of the Jewish community in South Africa, in Cape Town, and he starts telling me how wonderful his Chabad rabbi is. He's the most wonderful guy in the world, etc., etc. Then I meet a guy from Miami, and he tells me, well, my Chabad rabbis, this whole bus ride is telling me, for people around the world, telling me about their Chabad rabbis. It's pretty hilarious. And then I have to take pictures with them and WhatsApp them back to them. So the previous Rebbe is, he passes away in 1950. So he, in a sense, and I think that history has never given him due. And one of the reasons I decided to write this book.
But what, Rabbi Eliezrie, why now? Why write about him now? What is there something?
Well, I'll tell you what happened. I'll tell you what happened to me. And I believe in divine providence. I had written a book, The Secret of Chabad, that did very well. And I wanted to write another book. I always wanted to write about the previous Rebbe because I felt a certain kinship to him for two different reasons. The first time as a teenage kid that I came to the Rebbe was on the previous Rebbe's yahrzeit. So I felt kind of like this emotional bond. The second thing is that the previous Rebbe sent Hasidim into the to stand up to communism. Many of them lost their lives. Many of them spent time in Siberia. And I grew up surrounded by these Hasidim who had been the previous Rebbe's emissaries. And there's a joke among Hasidim. 2 Jahre in Tfisa, 2 years in prison is a mitzvah. 10 years in prison is a special mitzvah, hider mitzvah, a beautiful mitzvah. And I grew up among these people who the previous Rebbe inspired to lay their lives on the line in Russia in the 30s and the 40s and the 50s. And by the time I was a yeshiva student in the early 70s, they were older people by that time. But they were my role models. And the final kicker was what happened to me. I was at a Chabad conference some years ago, and a friend of mine, Rabbi Mendel Kalmanson, who's a wonderful author in London, says to me, David, somebody's got to write a book about the Frierdiker Rebbe, the previous Rebbe. I said, Mendel, you're right. I've even laid out the book and planned it. My problem is I need money for research. So there's a guy standing next to him, a Chabad philanthropist. I happen to know. He's overhearing the conversation. He says, that's not a problem. And so I felt like the divine providence orchestrated I should write this book. But I've always been very inspired by the previous Rebbe's courage, because he stands up to the Tsarist anti-Semitism. He stands up to communism. He stands up to the coldness of American Judaism, which wants to assimilate in the early 1940s when, as the famous Jewish sociologist Dr. Marshall Sclair calls, Orthodoxy was a case study in institutional decay. He wants to change direction. And I was always very much in awe of his personality and what he accomplished. And I felt, you know what? He needs the historical due. And if you want to understand about today, you have to understand his story.
So you talked about the research that's required and the money that you had to raise. And I was looking through the book, and it seems you looked through letters, diaries, Soviet-era archives. You visited places throughout Europe. You went to sites that gave you more of the weight of the Sixth Rebbe's story. And by the way, he was arrested how many times? 7 times or something?
He was arrested
like that?
The first time he was an 11-year-old kid. He's arrested.
Right.
He's arrested 11 times.
A bunch of different times. There's a lot of reason to think that maybe he shouldn't have even survived in all of these different trials and tribulations.
Well, the last time he was sentenced to death.
Right. And there were letters that had to be translated, Yiddish, Hebrew. So, I mean, give us a sense of the scope of what was entailed here.
The previous Rebbe was a prolific writer. We have 17 volumes of his published letters, which are over 6,000 letters that are close to 6,000 letters that are published. And there's much other historical material that's not published. So I was, number one, able to get this tremendous amount of resources of his letters. I was able to, let's say the Russian National Library happens to have the Russian government captured letters that he wrote to his wife in his visit in America in 1929 when he was here for a year. So let's say, however I was able to get them, but some of those letters. I had the correspondence of his primary secretary and aide, over 600 letters from the 1930s, where you get a real insight to the inner world of the Rebbe's court at that point, because his main secretary, his primary administrator, is writing letters to the contacts in America and around the world, and I got hold of all that correspondence. Wow. Plus, there's a lot of, we went into archives of the Joint has extensive relationship with the Rebbe. At times they were very supportive. At times the Rebbe disagreed with their strategy, but he also had a tremendous respect for the Joint. So all of their archives, in Russian archives. And beyond that, I went to Russia. This is not the first time I've been to Russia. But I went to Russia because I wanted to sense I wanted to see the streets he walked in. I wanted to see the buildings he lived in. I wanted to have a sense about him as a person, because when you're there and you feel that sense about him, you get a different kind of context. So you can write all about the town of Lubavitch, a little town in Russia where Hasidim used to come till 1915. It was a place of pilgrimage for over 100 years. But it's a lot different when you go to Lubavitch. And when you read stories about him being brought to the graves of his ancestors, where his father brings him as a 15-year-old kid and says, I'm putting you in to become now a Jewish community leader, and you stand in that same place, and the synagogue's been rebuilt, and you have a sense about it, you get a whole different understanding of his life. So we hired a bunch of archivists and historians. We did a tremendous amount of research. I did travel to Latvia, where he lived, and Russia, and the other places, and to try to give a sense of his life, and to really dig deep. And also something important, sometimes in the Chabad community, and I think this is true of almost any community, we have a tendency to rely on our own sources. But I went way beyond the Chabad community. I wanted to hear viewpoints of historians that I don't necessarily agree with. And I wanted to get a much more, so we explored, a variety of different perspectives. Like one of the interesting caveats that came out, that the Rebbe is oppressed in Russia very heavily starting the early 1920s. At the same time, a similar thing is happening to the Zionist movement. And there's a parallel between the two. So no Chabad writer has ever before taken that parallel. And I thought it was very interesting because when you see how the difficulties of the Zionist movement in Russia in the early 1920s, and you see the Rebbe's difficulties, there's a certain kind of parallel because the Russian government was sometimes being oppressive and sometimes not, and you could see that dichotomy and have a broader, nuanced picture of the history.
So, if I look throughout his life, he remained, I would say maybe calm, if that's not the right term, but religiously defiant, whether it was under Soviet interrogation, the death sentence that he got. And he also the Sixth Rebbe rebuilt Jewish life 3 times, right? It was after the persecution in Russia, after Stalin, and again in the United States of America. So when you look at the Rebbe, what drove that relentlessness? Was it faith? Was it pride?
I think
willpower? What was the combination? Because I don't want to make a lahavdil. This might be heresy to say, to compare him to the Lubavitcher Rebbe. But it seems...
No, I think there was a very difference between the Rebbe's life and the previous Rebbe's life. The Rebbe's life, he becomes Rebbe in 1951. He's in New York in a stable political environment. He doesn't have to go anywhere.
Exactly.
He has a certain degree of financial support, which is
security, at least physical security.
And as a chassid, the Rebbe was a constant. In other words, if I was in New York and I wanted to go to Mincha, to go to the afternoon service by the Rebbe, I knew every day, 3:15, 90% of the time, he's going to be there. And all I got to do is turn up. So he's in one place his whole time. He almost never travels, the Rebbe, except to go to visit some summer camps a few times. Other than that, he never took a vacation, never went anywhere, and you could see him every day and every Shabbos. It was a constant. The previous Rebbe's life was turmoil. And number one, he had to reinvent himself. He has 3 different periods of leadership as a Rebbe, because number one, facing down communism, where he has a whole series of challenges which are very unique. Number 2, trying to reinvigorate, bring Hasidic life to Western Europe, where, guess what? In Poland, there is very other prominent Hasidic leaders, the Ger Rebbe, the Belzer Rebbe, the Bubber, the Alexander, and Chabad is tiny. And he's got to come there and try to figure out how does Hasidic life work in Western Europe. And then when he comes to America in the early 1940s, it's a whole different type of challenge. One of the interesting things about him is his ability to adapt to a different paradigm. And before he's Rebbe, he's fighting the Tsarist Russia. I mean, as a young 20-year-old man, he's going off to Holland to convince bankers to cut off the flow of money and loans to the Russian government because of anti-Semitism and because of pogroms that they're orchestrating. So that kind of leadership, which is a lot of us go through life and we get hit with a curveball, and we don't know how to adapt to it. He gets hurt with multiple curveballs, and one of his greatest strengths is this ability to adapt. But going back to your question of inspiration, I think it's 2 or 3 things. I think number one, his father had a phenomenal impact off his life. He sees himself as an emissary of his father, the 5th Rebbe. Number 2, he's a man of deep spirituality and deep faith. People talk about meeting with him privately, how, for me, I had meetings with the Rebbe, and those were very transformational events because you felt that you were in the presence of holiness. You felt that this is a person who lives on a higher spiritual plane. But for the people who went into the previous Rebbe, they said the same thing. So here you had a man who's deeply rooted in spirituality. He has also tremendous physical handicaps because he's not well. Since the early 1930s, he's facing disease. He gets multiple sclerosis, and he's eventually in a what's his name in a wheelchair. So he has tremendous adversity. And despite all of those things, the passion and the faith, and that's why I picked the title for the book, Undaunted. Nothing slows him down.
Tell us, there's the story of when he, as a young child, defended, a butcher, and got arrested for it.
Yeah, it's really, I think, representative of his life. He's an 11-year-old kid. He has a problem also as a young child. His father was very ill in his early years of his life.
His father was the Rebbe before him.
Yeah, well, it took time because what happened was his grandfather passes away in 1883, and he's the fourth Lubavitcher Rebbe. His father is a young man, only 22 years old, and he doesn't yet accept the position of Rebbe, and he doesn't really accept it for about 11 years. In the meanwhile, there's competing Chabad courts, which is a whole other story. You could write another book about it. Because some of the descendants of the third Rebbe created it was like 4 or 5 Chabad Rebbes at one point in the late 1800s. But his father is away a lot because he's getting medical care. He has his own medical challenges. He was diagnosed with tuberculosis by the Russian government when he went to the draft. So he has medical problems. So here is a young man who's spending a lot of time growing up in his grandmother's house, and he writes the story in his diary as an 11-year-old kid. What happened was he would study Mishnah, and his father would give him money. So he wanted to buy himself a watch. His father said, "What are you buying a watch? You should take the money and use it to help other people." He creates a micro-loan fund. We call in Hebrew a gamach. And he starts lending money to the farmers in the town of Lubavitch so they can go, the people who live in the town of Lubavitch, so they go out to the farms, they can buy merchandise, I don't know if it's fruit or vegetables or a cow or chickens and whatever, and they can bring them into town and sell them. So he's into the microloan business, and he encounters this guy in the street who's carrying a chicken and a lamb and all that, and suddenly a policeman turns up and accuses of stealing the lamb. And the 11-year-old kid, the Rebbe, stands up to defend him, and he starts attacking the policeman. Well, they haul him into the local jail, and when they realize who he is, after sitting there for a while, they say, "Listen, we're sorry we did this to you," because he was his uncle was very well known in the town. His father was out of town, but his uncle was very known. But his father says to him, "No, what did you do? You spent a little time in jail because you put your life on the line. You tried to help another Jew. And what did you do when you were in jail? You studied Mishnah by heart. You did good." His father was proud of him for getting arrested. But he gets arrested repeatedly. Sometimes he's just detained for short times. But the ultimate case is what happens in 1927, where he's arrested because of this underground network that he's created across the country. And
across Russia.
All across Russia. And the Isvexia, which is run by Jews, Jewish communists, and the two people who arrest him both come from Chabad families. 2 young men who are this was the time when people were so enamored with, listen, communism got rid of the anti-Semitism of the Tsar. We can't forget that. It did some good things as much as it did a lot of terrible
people,
things.
by the way, are still enamored with communism. Look what's happening in New York City.
I know, look at New York. They're still enamored with communism and socialism. But so, and he's arrested. He's sentenced to death. There's a turmoil in the whole Jewish world. People intervene. The President of the United States sends a notification. What the heck are you taking the Rebbe for? Pressure comes from all over the world, and also within Russia. And eventually they say, "Okay, we're letting you out of prison," and then they finally exile him. They allow him to leave Russia because they're going to kill him. Mm-hmm. There's no question he wouldn't have lasted in Russia. So that's the culmination of all, where he's brought into a prison in the middle of the night. One of the most prominent leaders at that time of world Jewry. And he is, because he is the Lubavitcher Rebbe. And there's no question he is the most powerful, rabbinical figure in Russia at the time. That's unquestioned. And when we see from the way he was received a year later in America that his popularity was...
So explain to me for a moment. So he leaves Russia, Soviet Union. He goes to the United States.
No, he doesn't go to the United States. He goes to live in Riga, in Latvia.
Okay.
That's where he's exiled. And from Riga, the next 3 or 4 years, from 1927 to 33, he's in Riga, but he doesn't see this as a permanent place because he wants first to establish a yeshiva in Riga. And he felt, this is a really, almost a forgotten part of the story. Chabad has an educational system called Yeshivas Tomchei Tmimim. That's the name of the yeshiva. That yeshiva was established in 1897 when the previous Rebbe tells his father, "Let's make the yeshiva." And his father gives him a wedding gift, which is to make the yeshiva. That yeshiva today probably has 50 branches in the world. And it was a revolutionary yeshiva because it integrated in the curriculum. It wasn't just classic Talmudic learning, but it included Hasidic philosophy, because the fifth Rebbe, his father, wanted to create a new kind of Jew that was emboldened spiritually, a very different approach to Jewish learning. It's revolutionary. So the yeshiva to him is the trust that his father gave him. He tries to make a yeshiva in Riga, but can't do it because they want to draft the yeshiva boys. Eventually he has to move to Warsaw. And from Warsaw, he moves to a suburb called Otwock. So here he is in Western Europe, trying to bring Hasidic life, Chabad Hasidic life, which really doesn't exist. And there's many other prominent, he's almost like a king without a nation, because you have these massive, large Hasidic groups. Okay, the Lubavitcher Rebbe is a very prominent person, and we believe he's holy and a tzaddik and all that, but real Hasidim are all back in Russia. So, and he's trying to rebuild in this environment, which is very, very difficult. And he creates a network of yeshivas in Poland, which has 1,500 students by the beginning of the war. It's a lot of students. Some of the best yeshivas in Poland were his yeshivas.
He goes to America to fundraise. Is that why?
No, he goes to America. No, the real reason he goes to America, he goes in 1929. And the reason he goes to America is threefold. The first reason is, most importantly, his concern for Russian Jewry. And he's trying to get the joint. He has a conflict with the joint. The Joint Distribution Committee, which is a major Jewish organization, which had supported him at first, but then became enamored with the communists setting up colonies, agricultural colonies, which he didn't speak publicly against, but he was upset. He felt it was a mistake. He wants to go to the leadership of the Joint in America to convince them how they should dedicate their resources to help Russian Jewry. Mm-hmm. He also wants to raise money for Russian Jewry. He needs money. He is running an educational system all over the country. He's got hundreds and hundreds of people underneath his employ. He is sending food packages to Russia. He's spending every dollar he can raise, and he needs money, so he comes to America to try to raise the awareness of American Jewry for the plight of Russian Jewry underneath communism. And so that's the first reason. The second reason is he plays a major role in trying to strengthen Jewish life around the country, because he travels, and again, he's getting massive crowds because he escaped communism. He's a Hasidic Rebbe. At that time, there were many, many Jews who had a much more stronger connection to tradition than now, a century later. So again, as I mentioned before, he's getting crowds of 5, 10, 15,000 people when he turns up in a city. And the next thing is that he wants to connect to those Hasidim, Chabad followers that have come to the United States. And he wants to, and after that, there's a serious consideration about moving to America, which he decides to defer. And he decides, and that comes, he already decided before the war to move, but he really doesn't come till the war hits. So he comes here on this three-pronged trip. He meets with people like Justice Brandeis. Stephen S. Wise comes to see him. Interesting caveat.
And Herbert Hoover. Like, why
met with him in the White House.
Why would the president want to meet him?
Because he's a very prominent rabbi, and he wants to thank him for the help of the United States in saving his life. That's officially the reason for the meeting. And he met with Brandeis a few times. Brandeis was extremely enamored by the Rebbe. And when he's frustrated with the JDC and the Joint, which is, there's a man called Felix Wahlberg, who's the president of the JDC, who became very much, he thought the solution for Russian Jewry is going to be to create these communist colonies. And they spent an immense amount of money, the JDC, during those years, $250 million in today's dollars, in taking Jews and putting them in agricultural colonies. And by the mid-1950s, they were all closed. So he's trying to convince the Jewish leadership in America, we need to worry about, we have other strategies and about how to help Russian Jews. We can create home-based industry so they can work wherever they want to work. We need to make sure they have food and clothing. And he's having this debate, and he's coming with a position of authority, because he's the great rabbi who was saved from the communists. He got out of jail. He got out of the death sentence. So he meets with leaders of the American Jewish community. When he fails with the Joint, he tries to create an alternative leadership structure involving Justice Brandeis, and Brandeis says to him, listen, I'm a justice in the Supreme Court. I can't do it. He's doing everything he can, and he's going out there literally raising money, which he's using for Russian Jewry.
So let's look at where we are today in Lubavitch Chabad. What of his legacy lives on?
I think
today?
The legacy that lives on, most importantly, I believe there's a series of legacies that are very, very important here. The first thing is that in 1946 and 1947, late 46 and early 47, 1,000 Chabad Hasidim escaped Russia on false Polish passports. What had happened during the war is that many Poles ran to Russia, and after the war, the Russian government said, you can be repatriated back to Poland, and if you happen to marry a Russian, you can go also. Well, guess what? there was a lot of passports around, and they took false passports and they doctored them, and 1,000 Hasidim, men, women, and children, leave the country. These are people who spent 25, 30 years under communism. These are hardcore Hasidim. They're religious. They're full of passion. They're full of vigor, etc., etc. And comes from that a few things. Number one, until that point, the Rebbe really doesn't have much human capital. He has some Hasidim in America. He's got a yeshiva in New York with 30, 40 students maybe. He's got another yeshiva in Montreal. But now he's got 1,000 hardcore Hasidim come out of the country. Plus he has a group of rabbinical students that come from Shanghai. Now those Hasidim became the nucleus in the revolution that he brought about in the later part of the later part of the country, the war, and their children become the emissaries of the present Rebbe, starting in the early 1950s. It creates human capital. And then to my generation, they were the role model about self-sacrifice. When I went to make a Chabad center in California, and I struggled to raise money and hardships and difficulties, I'd always say to myself, what's your big problem? Your teacher went to Siberia. The Rebbe said, I had a teacher in yeshiva, a Mendel Futafas, 9 years in Siberia. So what is my difficulty in California? So number one, it gave the human capital to build Chabad in the post-war era. Number two, it gave the inspiration to my generation of Chabad Shluchim to do what we are doing today because they were our role models. So that's one level of legacy. The other level of legacy is in many ways. What he created in Russia lasted through the Soviet Union. And when I heard Prime Minister Yitzchak Shamir, I came to a memorial service for the Lubavitcher Rebbe 30 years ago in Tel Aviv. It was 30 days after his passing. And Shamir was the keynote speaker. And he gets up there and he says, the Mossad started coming to Russia in the early 1950s. We thought we were going to connect with Jewish leaders. And we found out that in every Jewish community in the country, there was a secret system being run by the Rebbe in Brooklyn. The Rebbe was running it, but the previous Rebbe created it. And the Israeli government comes to terms with this fact that this system, Golda Meir famously, she told a group of soldiers in the Yom Kippur War, when they asked her, is it worth this whole thing, what we're fighting, this battle? There's a famous picture of her sitting up in the Golan Heights, surrounded by Moshe Dayan, the chief of staff, Dudu Lazar, and she said, is it worth fighting for Israel? And she said, well, I learned the lesson. When I came to Russia as the Israeli ambassador, and she was not a big shul goer, let's be honest. She was far from the religious. She goes to Rosh Hashanah, the first day synagogue in the famous synagogue in Moscow, and there's nobody there. And the second day she comes, and there's thousands of people waiting for her. And she said later on in an interview that who brought out the crowd to welcome her? It was the Chabad underground. And she said also it was the only moment in her life she thought of becoming religious, which is pretty far-fetched if you know Golda Meir. What I'm trying to say is that the second thing is the Russian thing. And the third thing is that he changed the direction of American Jewry because he created the first network of Jewish day schools, and he changed the worldview. And underlying something else is something else. As the Orthodox world took the policy of insularity, both here, especially in Israel, but also in America, he has a different strategy when it comes to the establishment of the State of Israel. He has a different approach.
That's what I wanted to ask you. Very nuanced, it seems.
Very nuanced.
Explain.
Chabad had struggled with Zionism for many years because
it's secular, right?
Because it's the idea of changing the foundations of Jewish identity and replacing it with a secular nationalistic identity. So originally, the early Zionist group Bilu came to the fourth Rebbe and they said, "Would you support us?" And they said, well, it says Bilu is named after the verse in the Torah, Bet Yaakov L'chu V'necha, the house of Jacob, let us go out. So he tells them, add the last two words of the verse in the Torah, which is Bar Hashem and the light of God, and I'll support you. And they said, forget it. So you had this break. And Chabad historically had a very negative view of Zionism because it was changing the core values of Jewish identity. Now comes the state, 1947, 1948. The interesting story, a very interesting caveat. Zalman Shazar, who's Israel's first minister of education, two-term president of Israel, came from a Chabad family. He's managing the vote in the UN for the establishment of the state, I think it's probably around November 1947. Mm-hmm. And he was even though he had was not so religious, he was still very connected to Chabad. And the day of the vote, which is Friday morning, he gets a phone call from the Rebbe's son-in-law, and he tells him the Rebbe wants to know how the vote's going to be, the previous Rebbe. So what's his name? Shazar tells him, and we know there was a letter that the previous Rebbe had sent to Shazar the week before. There's a connection between the two. He says to him, things are looking very bleak. It's Friday morning. We think we're going to lose. We need Rachamei Shamayim. We need heavenly mercy. In other words, Rebbe, pray for us. So the son-in-law, Rabbi Shmari Garari, is the first son-in-law. He tells him, hold the line. He comes back to him a few minutes later, and he tells him like this in Yiddish, Ividvinin mit hasafa. You're going to win with extra. What happens? The vote's pushed from Friday to Saturday night, and the Russians switch, and we know what happened. The state's endorsed. Tuesday night, Shazar's in Brooklyn at the Rebbe's Hasidic gathering in honor of the liberation of the first Chabad Rebbe, the Yud Kislev, and all he speaks about that night is about settling Eretz Yisrael and the first Hasidic Aliyah that happened 200 years earlier. So this is what's his name? This is like he's endorsing this. But then comes the question, how do we deal with this new state? So we know a lot of this information from Shazar, because he retold these stories time and again. So the first thing was establishing Kfar Chabad, the Chabad town in Israel. So they want to put it up north in Meron. Meron, as anybody who knows anything about Jewish history in Meron, Meron is the burial site of the great rabbinic sage, Reb Shimon Bar Yochai. It's a sleepy little village, except for once a year when people come to visit. It's like the expression in Yiddish, Yen Ek Welt. It's like you're moving not to Bakersfield, California, but you're moving to Eureka, California. That old song, Out in the Boondocks?
Yeah.
The Rebbe says, no, I don't want to be there. I want to be next to Tel Aviv, because I want to engage modern Israeli society. I want to influence the Rebbe society. And where was Kfar Chabad established? A 10-minute drive, with traffic was normal.
Near the airport, central.
Right near the airport, right parallel to the airport. So he wants Kfar Chabad, the center of Chabad in Israel. There were Chabad institutions in Israel before that, but he wants to make a town and a city, and he's going to bring all these Russian refugees that escaped from Russia, and he's plopping them down. And the first thing is, I want it next to Kfar Chabad. Secondly, he says, I want all my people to work. Everybody's got to get a job. I mean, go learn in yeshiva, but once you finish, you have to have real employment. And then when the Hasidim come to him and they say, what about going to the army? He says, everybody has to share in the defense of the country. And Chabad has had an historic arrangement with the Israeli military, which was tragically, I would say destroyed or changed or invalidated by a recent Supreme Court. But we've had first an unofficial agreement and an official agreement for the last 20 years, where Chabad students will study in yeshiva for a few years, and later on they'll go to the army. And we've lost probably over a dozen Chabad soldiers, here since the war started. I saw just a video now about a Chabad soldier who was in Syria and had 2 legs blown off, and a tragic story. So, and it became the norm that you go to yeshiva and later. I'm not talking about the women. I'm talking about the men. He takes a fundamentally different attitude toward it. And then he does another thing. He says, number one, I don't want anybody I don't want Chabad in a political party. Chabad is not involved in politics. So Chabad Hasidim will vote for probably more religious and right-wing, even though every year they publish how many people vote in the town of Kfar Chabad, like they do in every city in Israel. And there's one voter for the Meretz party. That's the left-wing party. Nobody knows who the guy is. Maybe it's just a guy who wants to make trouble. I'd love to know who the left-wing voter is in Kfar Chabad, for Meretz, the secular anti-religious party. But he says, we're not going to be involved in the politics of the country. He doesn't agree with the position of the religious Zionist world that the state is the beginning of the redemption of the Jewish people. He does not agree with the attitude of the Haredi world, we're going to separate ourselves from modern Israeli society. He takes a middle ground. Chabad is still not celebrating secular nationalism, but we're going to become active members of the society. We're going to make a positive contribution. We're still waiting for Mashiach to come. This is not the final redemption, but we're going to support the country. And interestingly enough, when you look at the meetings between the Lubavitcher Rebbe and all the prime ministers and presidents and government officials and members of the Mossad and everything like this, it's not about how much money you can give to my local yeshiva or Chabad house in Metula or something like that. That's not what it's about. It's about one thing. It's about what we can do to contribute for this society. And many times the conversations are about, You know, as Yitzchak Rabin had a meeting with the Rebbe in 1972, and as he walked out of the meeting, he remarked to Ambassador Yehuda Avner, that man knows more about the security of the state of Israel than 120 members of the Knesset. So it was always about the welfare of the state, the security of the country, and that it should stay strong. And you may not agree with the Rebbe's positions, which were based on Jewish law, but it was always a strong support. So we're still not celebrating the redemption, but at the same time, we don't believe with the Haredi world that you should go and separate yourself and lock yourself in Bnei Brak and not be active members of the society. It's a nuanced position.
It's a nuanced position. It's interesting. And you know what? It fits into Chabad and Lubavitch, one thing you can always say, wherever you are in the world, and Israelis know this very well, you will always be welcome in a Chabad house, whether it's a shul or it's a middle of Thailand or Philippines, or I've been to places where you always find someone who will open up their house and take care of you, and that's and won't ask questions, and that's always been something unique about the movement.
Right, but I'm saying it's also rejecting the philosophy of insularity that we see in the Haredi world, which is, in other words, so Chabad is in the Haredi world, but it's challenging some of the values of the Haredi world, which I think creates a certain discomfort with us in parts of the Haredi community, and that is it's like we're in the middle, so to speak, but I guess what's interesting caveat about this, in the early 1950s, there was a guy who had an opportunity to create a car manufacturing company in Israel, and he didn't know if he should do it or not. I forgot the name of the company. It was France something. So he's told by his mother, if he has a dilemma in life, go to the Lubavitcher Rebbe. So he goes to the President Rebbe in New York, and he says, what should I do? He says, well, it's crucial. Israel needs an industry. And when you make cars, you end up doing things which are you have to use so many different parts. You're going to help spark the whole industry of the country. You got to make the car company. They created, not the best car in the world, because it'll spark the Israeli economy. So there's a different. It's not just what's good for us; it's what's good for the country and the society. So it's a very interesting, nuanced position, and I think many Israelis who may not be fully. That we're not all gung-ho about symbols of secular nationalism. At the same time, they realize that we're committed. We're part of the Israeli society, and we want to make a positive contribution.
Rabbi David Eliezrie, I want to thank you for joining me and for giving us the opportunity to learn more about the Friedige Rebbe, the previous.
In Yiddish, we'll call him the Friedige. We'll call him the Friedige Rebbe.
The Sixth Rebbe of Lubavitch, in your new book, Undaunted. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you for joining me on today's episode. As always, you can find us where podcasts can be found, YouTube, Spotify, Apple. Give us a 5-star rating. Check us out. Send it to your friends. This is an interesting episode with Lubavitch and Chabad. We all know about it, but here we learn a whole other world and dimension, as I did, into what's going on. So please share. In the meantime, have a great rest of your week, and we'll be back with you very soon.